Hi, and welcome back to the Global Summit on Economic Abuse. And for those that have just joined us or those that are coming back after lunch, we're really pleased to have you. And obviously, this is our final set of sessions, and we've been with everybody now for quite a few hours, and so we're really quite excited. So this panel is one of my most favorite. I'm quite blessed to be able to be with our incredible speakers, and it's called More Unheard Riches. You heard earlier on today from survivor advocates talking about their experiences and how they've put that forward. And we have another session as such. For those of you who are joining and that you may hear or see or feel something that could trigger the need, or you may feel that you want to access support, please do reach out to the Global Directory. It's all the information should pop up, or you should be able to find it within the platform itself or the event. It has a global resource of helplines and support lines, and there'll be, as the day goes on, other sort of support lines will pop up in there. But before I start, I just want to say that economic abuse is insidious. It's something that often happens in the midst of experiencing domestic abuse and often is unseen or and unfelt or unnoticeable by those who are working or surrounding you. And it can be something that continues to grow and is really, really sort of difficult to access support around. So we're really blessed to have three incredible survivor advocates with us, three women whom are striving to make a change, to raise the voice and share their own experiences in order to help those that may still be experiencing domestic abuse, but also to those that are surrounding a victim, or if you're concerned about somebody. It's really important that we step up and step in when we can do. And that obviously comes from being able to listen and learn from those that have experienced it and are willing to share. So please allow me to introduce Caroline Sorowski, whom has worked with us at No More for quite a number of years. She helped us develop the Survivor's Guide, which is a free to download guide for anyone who's experiencing domestic abuse who's based in the US. It's all got a whole host of US resources. And Hannah Grace Stedder, who is the chair of an organization, an NGO called Speak Your Truth Today, which provides real life support to those that are experiencing abuse on Facebook and has a number of different resources and tools available. And the incredible Barbara Winkler, whom has joined us at No More quite recently as one of our strongest supporters and advocates, and is sharing her experience with us today. So I think the best place for us to start would be to ask for you guys to share a little bit of your journey and your story, because one of the things that's so interesting is that each one of you have experienced economic abuse slightly differently. So Caroline, can I start with you and offer you the chance to share a little bit about your experience, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I was in an abusive relationship for a few years ago, and I suffered every type of abuse imaginable, including economic abuse, which left me with not a debt, but $1.3 million in the gutter because of this person's actions. So not only was I assaulted for years, he was also dilapidating my assets.
It's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I think as we go through the rest of the session, I think that's something we'll really pick into, because one of the things we often assume, and rightly or wrongly so, is that if you're experiencing an economic abuse, it often means that you yourself you don't have access to income, or the fact that your income or your ability to gain income is being hindered by that abusive partner. But I think, Caroline, what you'll share through this session is that the inverse can happen, that you can be the person whom is quite wealthy, the one who has access to many means, and how that can then be abused. So thank you so much for joining us, Caroline. Hannah, from your perspective, would you like to share a little bit about you and your experience?
Sure. So I have been out of my abusive relationship for 23 years. But at almost 18, I ran away from home into this person's arms. At 19 and a half, I went to the police and had him arrested for rape, attempted rape, assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful restraint, stalking, and 150 child porn charges. He was sentenced to a year in prison and then released. At age 20, after my divorce went through, I filed for bankruptcy for $150,000 at age 20. He had been The second you turn 18, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, you are inundated with credit card applications, and he would fill them all out, force me to sign them under threat of being physically harmed. And then once they got approved, have me call in and make him the approved user on the card. I then had no access to the cards, and he would use them at will. So by the time I was 20, I was $150,000 in debt and had no way to pay it back, and was all in my name. And I was informed very quickly that if he was in prison, I was still responsible for that money. So I had to file bankruptcy at that age. And I have spent the last 20 years dealing with the repercussions of being a 20-year-old bankrupt.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Hannah. I think in contrast, it's really interesting to see that at 20, you left with so much debt, and what the impact that has had on your credit report is incredibly powerful. And as we go through today's session, it'll be really interesting to dig into some of that space.
Yeah.
Barbara, would you like to share a little bit about you and your journey?
Yes, thank you for having me today. I'm so sorry for the things that Hannah and Caroline went through. So thank you for sharing that. In my personal journey, I think I was around 2019 when I met my abuser. We were together for about 7 years. We had a child, and I suffered for many years under everyday economic, physical, and emotionally abused up until when I decided to put my foot on the ground and said I cannot deal with this anymore. And I had no resources. All the accounts were monitored. And when I left, I was with zero money at 28 years old with a 4-year-old daughter in New York City, trying to figure out how to put food on the table with zero resources at one point, until I found help from different organizations, from the Family Justice Center and Sanctuaries for Family, who were immensely a great support that we have, luckily, in the city. And since then, I was able to recover. It was a long journey, started from zero, as you can imagine, trying to provide a home, which I was in an emergency domestic violence shelter, and relying on SNAP, housing, food stamps, and then finding my way as getting my career, right, to earn the living wage job. And I will share more later about the journey, but it was a very difficult time. And if I go back and somebody asks me, how did you do it? And I know that there was support, and I would ask for help.
Thank you, Barbara. I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, again, as we go through this session, everybody having such unique and different experiences is going to be really interesting as we go through and answer some of the questions that come up. I think one of the things, especially what you just said, Barbara, I can't even begin to imagine standing in one of the most expensive cities in the entire world, where you turn left or right and you have to pay money to try and survive with a 4-year-old. It must have been petrifying. And like you say, knowing that there were services and support available was key. But I suppose that's really where my first question sits with, is what kind of barriers did you face trying to access support? All of coming from really completely different situations. Caroline, from your perspective, what was the barriers that you faced when trying to access support around what you were experiencing?
Well, first and foremost, the parasite, that's how I call him, hasn't even been questioned by the police, especially with all the evidence, the photographic evidence, the banking evidence that I have and I provided the police with. He still hasn't been questioned. He hasn't been indicted. He hasn't been held responsible. So I believe that people who have more resources have a hard time being believed, and oftentimes they can be dismissed. I think there's still a little not a little, there's still a lot of stigma surrounding economic abuse in more affluent communities.
Which, I mean, what you're saying makes absolute sense. I mean, I think back to the times where we had answered the phone to women and children who were coming into the refuge. Many faced either that case of, well, I have means, can I access support in this way? Is it feasible for me to be using a helpline when actually I have means? And if I do, what type of response would I get? And I think that becomes a challenging piece. And also, the key point in all of this is being believed. Like you said, you went into the police station, they weren't able to completely believe you, and how your friends and your family members reacted is yeah, it's really
My
interesting.
friends and my family, of course, they believed me and they knew. It was just a matter of time for my brain to go there and fully grasp the reality of what was going on, of
Makes
what was
sense.
happening under my own roof. But the law enforcement aspect, which is something that I really needed at that time, they failed me.
I think it's really important because for you in that moment, you needed that response from the police to
Absolutely.
solidify what your experience was and to offer some level of reassurance and assurance that there is a journey in this, there is an outcome, there is standing up and stepping up, and then someone will be able to respond. Thank you so much for that. I think we'll loop back and talk a little bit about how we can respond and what that looks like if you are in one of those positions. Barbara, from your perspective, what kind of barriers did you face?
Yes. Well, at the beginning, when I first left, I knew there was an economic barrier there, and I had, again, zero assets to my name. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do? I remember I was a green card holder at the time. There were not a lot of benefits for me, except for my daughter, who's a US citizen. So I was trying to understand how to get by. And by meaning ask is reading how the human resources policy is and what the legislation is, like what am I entitled to for short-term, temporary, etc. And I remember when I went to the office, and again, you have all this emotions of this person's trying to find me where I am, and I'm trying to figure out the court system and all this environment trying to feed me of, oh my God, you have to be safe. So when I went to this office, I think the first thing that I realized is that people are overworked on the HRA, and my case was different. I needed help immediately. And I was just with a pile of papers, like literally 600 to 1,000 papers of me reading what should I be entitled of. And luckily I was skimming it. I asked for help, and they advised me you should qualify for the emergency DV since you qualify for what you have. And rely literally on $300 because I didn't qualify as a US citizen, only my daughter. So I had to live with that money. And I would often ask, but I'm still the mother. I am still the mother providing for her. And how am I not consider even my legal status as a green card holder as opposed to a US citizen? What's the difference? So those kind of barriers are often questioned, and I feel that they should be redacted in this type of situations. And then it will be after that, fast forward, would be not having credit, right? How do I build credit? What are the regulations? I need to be more economic, well aware, and financially literally, And back then I had little money. So how do you budget? And you come to zero from the groceries from $300 a week, right? A month, sorry. So those were the things that I had to navigate. Luckily, I had other resources that sanctuaries for families provided. Like, for example, the legal, it's so expensive. And luckily, I had that support. Uh, Therapy for my daughter and myself. And definitely around this holidays that people were so I was so grateful that people gave us so many gifts, so many gift cards for us to get by, and it was a tough holidays around Thanksgiving and Christmas. So that was one of the supports that I had. If I didn't, I couldn't imagine me even thinking of how to get by, right? So those were my different scenarios that I had to go on different hoops.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think what you're saying is so important, especially now because in the US you've had your, the shutdown that's happened and the huge impact that was being applied to SNAP benefits. And, you see it play out across social media about different people's experiences, but what you don't often hear is how that particular benefit can be life-saving and life-changing and be the difference between eating and not eating. And I think that sort of evidence is how important it is to be aware of that if you're not aware, and knowing that if you do see those calls around Christmas time for donations to women's shelters, think about that being the space that you donate to, because it can make the difference going into the next year. But I think you touch on something that's really evident, and actually evident globally, in a way that if you are moving or immigrating to a different country, your ability to access the internal support that country offers hindered by your immigration status. And what we do know is that those that choose to be abusive, who perpetrate abuse, often that's one of their ways of control, is to limit your ability to move through that immigration process to enable you to have citizenship. So, for example, in the UK, you can come to the UK on a spousal visa and not be entitled to any form of benefits. But if you move into the next stage of that immigration journey to indefinite leave to remain, you are entitled to it. So what we hear a lot of is perpetrators who freeze that immigration journey for their partners in order to control them financially. So I think, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think as we've spoken through today's, we've not actually spent a lot of time through the summit talking about how the different visas and immigration statuses can impact your ability to access support and in turn financial support. So thank you so much for touching on that. Hannah, from your perspective, I think you speak really quite eloquently about being young, and we've in preparation for this call and the chats that we've had, we've often spoken about how you can either grow up in a home with great financial literacy and in a home where nobody talks about money, and actually money can be something that causes arguments and fear and disharmony, and so even and shame, in fact, that if you carry debt, that is shameful, all the rest of it. So to hear your story and your sort of your experience, what were your barriers when you tried to seek support?
So, granted, this was 23 years ago. So I realize how far we have come since what I experienced. But that said, it isn't that different now versus then. When I left, there was no consideration for the economic abuse that I had suffered. There was no discussion about it. It was just something that was mine. I was stuck. Everything that I had experienced economically, it was almost the same as the emotional abuse, which was also not acknowledged at the time. The only thing that was acknowledged was the physical and sexual abuse. Everything else was ignored. And so after going through trials and going through all of the work, it took me 8 times to finally leave him and finally go and get him out of my life. I'm then suddenly realizing that I'm so far in debt that I can't get a car, I can't get a credit card, I can't get a job, I can't go back to school. I am lucky enough that my family was lower middle class and was able to envelop me in their love, and capable of supporting me during that time. When I moved back home, there was no way I could afford to live on my own at that point.
Mhm.
And so I was told that the only option was to file for bankruptcy, which then proceeded to impact my entire life. Um, I started a business with my father in my late 20s. And even as a business owner, I was not able to get a credit card or a car. My credit was completely ruined. My 85-year-old grandmother co-signed for my first car. Just even though I had a steady income,
Mhm.
everything looked good, but because of that bankruptcy there, nobody would touch me. And so she co-signed for my first car, and that actually was the start of me being able to slowly rebuild my life. But none of that would have been possible if it wasn't for the fact that my family was able to hold me at that moment. If I had been from a family with less means, or from a family with no means, or unable to be with my
Mhm.
family for whatever reason, I would have had nothing. I would have been on the street, lucky if I could get an apartment. I definitely would have ended up in a shelter instead of at my parents' home. There's no way I would have been able to continue my education, any of it. I am very fortunate in that aspect because I know many survivors that I've talked to and worked with over the years, um, who weren't that lucky, and have had to spend the rest of their lives living hand to mouth trying to make ends meet because of what they experienced then.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really interesting, and it's something that comes up quite often where we make a lot of assumptions about people who do not have access to money or not showing that they have lots of money. You know, we see it all across social media now that you are successful if you have money, you are unsuccessful if you don't have money. But what we never really sort of dig into is what are the stories behind why and what's trapping somebody in that situation. And, you know, you speak so importantly about how important and how, if you hadn't have had family, where would you have turned? And it always, you know, sort of rests with me whenever I see somebody who is unhoused, is that question: what is the difference between them and between, you know, the person who's living at home with their parents? The truth in the matter is, it's the fact that the person who's living at home with parents had that had that catchment net. And what we sort of don't often understand is many people just don't. So why services and become so important in our support of those services. I suppose, you know, sort of looking perhaps at the next part of the journey, what were the moments or the interventions that happened that made it, that were change points for you? Caroline, can I start with you and ask you that question first?
Um, the moment that changed everything for me was when I realized my bank account was being drained and drained and drained, and I was transferring money from investment account to checking account, and all of a sudden 2 days later there was no money. And how's that possible when I was the only person authorized to sign? So these little things amount to a big thing. And I just couldn't understand how the bank allowed a forgery to go through on one of my, not one, but like several of my checks. So that to me was the turning point. I was like, okay, I am being robbed under my own roof. I'm living with a psychopath.
Did the bank offer you any support in that moment?
No, not at all. Not at all.
That's really interesting.
Not at all. And it wasn't even a good forgery. It was a lousy forgery.
So that's really, really interesting, because what we've heard throughout today, in a way, from the different, from the banks in particular, some of the banks here in the UK, is that they've now sort of trained their staff to look differently at behavior that happens on bank accounts, and if they're seeing frequently or sort of changeable payments coming out or large payments out, they'll flag those accounts and then reach out in a different way. So it's interesting that nobody did. And then when you try to work with the bank after the fact, were they helpful in any way, or did you?
I didn't even try to work with a bank after I found everything. After I found out everything, I went to the police. I filed a police report. Actually, I filed 3 police reports. And since there was no movement there, I was like, let's go civil lawsuit.
That's really interesting. I'll come back and ask a little bit more about that. I mean, Barbara, from your perspective, I know that you've shared previously that your journey to where you are now has been really interesting, and how you've, and love to hear about what your turning point was. I was to give a little bit of background, the Family Justice Center in New York is incredible. It's a central space where lots of different agencies that offer support around domestic abuse are situated. So you can go into a singular place and access legal support, housing support, advocacy support, and not have to travel all across the city to those different agencies. And everyone's talking at the same way. They're sharing information. So you tell the story once. It's an incredible model that is sort of replicated in different parts of the US, and we have a couple here in the UK and around the world. So yeah, Barbara, please.
Yes, absolutely. I think my turning point was that once I asked for help and they listened to me, believing in me was the first turning point, because I was so blind and maybe was not aware of the things that would or might happen from the legal perspective, the housing perspective, the financial perspective. So I think me having these conversations with experts and leaders from Sanctuaries for Families or other appointed pro bono experts that helped me to guide me through my path was one of the biggest turning points, from 3 things. Number one was, how do I earn a living wage job? How do I refresh my skills? So I went to a cohort from Sanctuaries for Families called Economic Empowerment Program for 18 months, where you get certified on different aspects, whether it's technology, you find a path, whether it's finance, nursing, etc. I chose the finance part. And it was me trying to show up, dropping my daughter to school, having access to childcare. I think that was important. Stipend for, because I couldn't afford as simple as a Metro card, like the Metro. So stipend from these companies. And then after kind of pivoted into, okay, what's the next step from being in a DV shelter while studying court and getting services? How do you come to a place where you have no credit? How do you build it? Then how you earn an apartment for a lease? And luckily there were instances where I had to go through my lawyer and ask, look, there was a lease also under my name where I had to leave. What are my rights? And they advised, like, Barbara, you just put your police report, because New York protects DV survivors or victims. And once you present that, you are released from that lease and you don't have any kind of compromise to pay the whole amount. You're relieved from that in the case. So those kind of things, those legal advice really helped me understand what opportunities I had to not affect my credit or my status, etc. And then after was just asking for more help on, how do I rent an apartment if I rely on vouchers, right? Which is not too much that the government gives you. It goes by different brackets of how much the city puts on this housing vouchers, how many of your household members are there? And for me, it was, I think, if I remember, it was $1,500. Who would take that amount of money in New York City? Rent is so expensive. Not even a studio can afford that. So luckily, me working for 18 months relentlessly on getting an internship at a venture capital fund, then being hired at JP Morgan, and then combining that kind of status with a one-time shot from the government, which pays you the rent of, there was another service which pays you the rent for a year. If you have those requirements that you have a job or you're looking for a job, etc., and be in a DV shelter, think that really helped me place myself in an economic stability where I can slowly build up. And I was lucky enough, I met the right people. I asked for help, and I think it was a domino effect of the universe that gave me this opportunity for me and my daughter. And I was lucky enough, to be in this position. So I'm very grateful.
I mean, I would also say that you were incredibly determined and hardworking and focused on your future, and that you wanted it more than anything. It was luck at part, but mostly it was you. But I think one thing that I heard, and I'm sure Hannah and Caroline will agree with me, was that like it's a chess game trying to get all of those benefits and support in place at the right time, but everything hinges on something else happening. And even listening to you now and explaining it, it was a case of like, well, how would anyone know that those things are available without knowing that they're available? It seems all quite hidden and quite sort of, you will find out if you're speaking to an agency or if you have something else, which is what we sort of heard throughout the summit in some ways, that there are resources, but how do you know what resources are available? How do you raise your hand and say, can you help me around debt that I may have? Or how do you even start those questions around how do I build up a good credit report when, if you've grown up in a home where, economic literacy is not the primary piece? But Hannah, I'm really interested to hear about, from your perspective, what your turning point was and where you managed to get support and help from that made the difference.
Well, as I mentioned before, I was lucky enough to be at my parents' home. And then starting a business with my father, they were able to get a small business starter loan from a bank in our hometown that specializes in giving people chances when there is no money to start with. And that's how we started our business. Was with this loan under my parents' name. So a couple years later, I need a car. I can't get a car. My parents' credit is shot due to me. They had co-signed on some things with my abuser. And so their credit was also shot. Not to the point of bankruptcy, but they also had no credit. And they had two younger children who they were trying to get through high school and hopefully into college, and there was no money. So nobody would co-sign on a loan for me. Luckily, my 85-year-old grandmother was willing. And that was probably the biggest turning point for me, was having that support right there, because that started showing the credit world that I had a steady payment of something. Because previously I couldn't get a credit card, I couldn't do anything. So all people saw was rent and bank accounts, and neither was good enough when you have a bankruptcy as your backdrop. And that bankruptcy stays on your credit report depending on the credit company you're looking at. So one is for 7 years, one is for up to 13 years.
Wow.
And it still sits there and it says, hi, look at me. And it's not something that you can hide or get away from. So people are not interested in talking to you until that starts to be way in the rear view. The biggest change for me was, even after building up all of that, I could get maybe one credit card with a very high interest rate. With I think it had a limit of $200, and I was ecstatic. And I think the biggest thing for me was when it started finally dropping off of my credit score. When my credit report stopped showing the bankruptcy, that's when I was able to start actually having a credit score that reflected my current financial and capabilities and my responsibilities. And so I was able to start living that life that way. But to this day, I still do not have financial safety with others. My husband and I have separate accounts. We keep everything very separate, and we have some joint stuff because we have a child and life and we live together. But in all honesty, we keep things as separate as possible because we never know what's going to happen down the road. And neither of us wants to end up in a situation where someday something happens and either my background comes back and affects his life, or something happens with his family or his life and then it affects mine. And so we have decided to keep things separate as much as possible. And so that's 23 years later, I'm still suffering from that. And I don't know that there was any sort of big supports out there for me. There was nobody was willing to even talk about it, as the concept of financial or economic abuse was not something that I had ever heard of or was discussed probably until about 5 years ago. And it wasn't something that we discussed. It was just part of something I dealt with.
Absolute sense. Actually, I would agree with you. Even here in the UK, it's been 5, 6 years since it's become something that we are constantly talking about. Obviously, we've had our Domestic Abuse Act, and we have provision within there that talks about economic abuse and its whole spectrum of it. But how the legal system and how it prosecutes is slowly catching up. I think there's something that you mentioned which was really interesting, and I think it has a further impact as we more into the space of everything is online, everything is about, a system that sort of approves everything, is that most of the time now we fill in these documents that talk about, they ask you questions, you fill everything in, they do a credit report on Experian or whomever they may do it on, and it's all computer generated, the answers. And so there is no discretion built within there. And when there's no discretion, there is no understanding, and there's no sort of that unique moment where you're able to negotiate or that type of thing. Like, you hear of those days gone past where you could go into your local bank and see your bank manager who knew you and who knew your circumstances and who had the capacity to be able to sort of mold things and shape things in a different way to be helpful. So, yeah. So I suppose that leads me in a really great space, really. But what do you think needs to change? Big question. So I'm going to ask you to choose only one area in particular about what needs to change for other people who are in similar or experiencing economic abuse currently. And Barbara, can I start with you?
Yes. What needs to change? I believe having a playbook or a handbook it would be really helpful on each city, on each country, to have a playbook of where to go on resources, right? And updating it every year, because I know things get out of business or legislatively things change. So a place where people can go in-house to understand resources. I think that's life-changing. And I mean, programs like No More, it's that partnership that we need in order for survivors to know that there's organizations out there that would help us in dire situations like this. And I mean, it's life-changing how a community can come up together and help others in need for the better, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's true what you say is it's knowing where to go and who to go to at whichever moment. I do also think there's that piece around knowing that if you did make that phone call to somebody and to tell them that that you're fearful of if you're experiencing abuse, that the fear of what debt will do to you and the stigma that it's attached to debt is not going to be placed on you is really key. We still hold a lot of, as society, a lot of stigma around debt. Some people furnish debt in a way which is powerful. It enables them to gain more growth financially. But for the vast majority of people, debt is a weight that we carry around our necks. And I think, Hannah, you spoke quite eloquently about that you were able to get a credit card, but with a huge interest rate with a limited amount of spend. So actually that even, you're still penalized for even trying to get that good credit report and credit rating. So that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that, Barbara. I think it's something that we're always considering at No More. And I know that the International Coalition Against Domestic Economic Abuse has a number of resources on their website. But like you say, it's that consistency of keeping them up to date and everyone working towards it. Caroline, what are your thoughts about what we should do differently?
I think the laws need to be changed. I think the statute of limitations in when it comes to domestic violence is ridiculous. I think here in California is only 5 years. Economic violence is still violence, and it should be treated as a crime. I think it needs to be made into an aggravating circumstance to domestic violence. One of the reasons I didn't even go to the bank to try to negotiate was the statute of limitations, because for context, the abuser was writing himself, stealing my checkbook and writing himself checks and forging my signature. So that happened over the years, and some of those amounts I would not be able to get back because the statute of limitation had expired. I believe the authorities need to look at this as a serious crime, because victims, survivors, they're not idiots. They're not stupid for being victimized. We are not low intellect people because somebody, some evil entity came into our lives and destroyed it for a moment. We're all very intelligent women. We are not, and I hear a lot, oh, she was so dumb. No, I don't think so. I think we unfortunately ran into some really bad people, and they need to be looked at as such. I think the laws need to be stricter around economic abuse.
I would agree with you on that one. I think it's you've hit on, you've mentioned an incredibly important point in the fact that economic abuse, like coercive controlling behavior, the psychological abuse, does not happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a way where most people can identify it straight away. It's insidious, it's slow burning, it's pulling away at your self-esteem and your emotions. And so actually, you would expect like, oh, I would have seen that happen. But the reality is that you probably wouldn't have, because it's the abuser's objective to keep it hidden, to keep you questioning, to keep you guessing about what is right in your sense of reality, and them sort of twisting it. And I think that's often so completely misunderstood by all those people who are around, who are asking, but how did this happen? It happened slowly. It happened in a way which it seemed reasonable, seemed feasible in its isolation, but collectively it started to build and build and build. And Hannah, I think you speak to that quite lovely when you talk about what happened with you. From your perspective, what needs to change?
That is always such a giant question to me. But I think the biggest thing is, and I've mentioned this before on other panels, is talking about it. I think showing, the three of us right here, which is an amazing moment that we are out here talking about this. But we're not the only three that have experienced this. This is pretty much standard operating procedure when it comes to a domestic violence situation, that at least some form of this is occurring, because it helps with the isolation, because it helps with the control. And until that becomes part of everyday conversation with survivors and those experiencing it, and social understanding of what domestic violence looks like, I think we're going to be in the same boat where it's taboo or it's not discussed or it's not treated with credibility. And I think that for a huge majority of those suffering, it's one of the most long lasting aspects, second only to emotional abuse, that is never discussed and it's
Mm-hmm.
never supported. And we don't have support groups that discuss it. And we don't have advocates who are out there saying, hey, and that's something that we're starting to change. But I think having more and more awareness around it and making the public aware that this is something we're suffering from, I think will help societal's views and our personal views and our ability to reach out for help.
So true. It is so true. It's asking the right questions when we know, like when you can ask those right questions. But I suppose in that moment, like, what are those right questions? Because if you think that you're sitting with your group of friends and you're going for dinner and you are concerned about your friend who's to the left of you, you're seeing perhaps that they are the first one to say they can't come to something because, or they're not allowed to, or they're checking each purchase with somebody. How do you start a conversation about money in a group of friends where money hasn't been something you've ever spoken about before? How do we start that in a way where it doesn't feel that there's stigma or shame or there's envy or jealousy or there's, that hierarchical of needs and all the rest of it? How do we have this conversation about money in a society where money is so attached to status? I said that's the big piece in it.
Yeah.
So, Hannah.
I could talk about that for an hour.
Yeah, I think it's that piece, isn't it? I mean, I suppose that the thing is it's like how do we do it? What are your thoughts about how we ask those questions of our friends? How would you have liked to have been asked if there was a friend that was concerned about what was happening to you?
And I think for me, the biggest thing to do is to ask if they're okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the first start is, hey, I noticed that like you're checking in. Like, does that feel good to you? Is that something you want to be doing, checking in with them? And that can even lead to the first conversation about what is happening in that relationship beyond just that immediate moment. Hey, that's something I'm noticing. Maybe, are you okay with that? Like, does that feel good to you to have to check in when you spend $5?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like, even if it's not a conversation you're used to having with your friends, being that moment of being like, hey, or even taking them aside separately so that way it's not in a group,
Mm-hmm.
having that quiet moment and being like, hey, I noticed you had to check in on that. Does that feel good to you? Like, is that where you want to be? Um, and then you can offer resources and discussions from that moment. But I think like even in our society today where it's not normative to have these conversations, having those little tiny moments of just checking in on your friends, no matter what it is about, I think is the best way to help those in those situations.
Caroline, would you like to add anything to that?
I had a conversation with a friend of mine back when I was with a parasite, and I mentioned to her that some pieces of jewelry of mine were missing, and it kept happening. And she said, I'm going to take you to get a safe. I said, no, but I have a safe. She said, no, I'm going to take you to get a better safe. Kind of like trying to make me understand that, this is happening under your roof because of one person. There's no such thing as ghosts. Objects are not going to disappear unless somebody is taking them.
Mm-hmm.
And who's the only other person with access to your safe, with access to your stuff? So that was her very tactful way of saying, I see what's happening and I'm going to help you.
It's a really interesting point. It's really great. I suppose the other challenge is, isn't it, is when you enter into that relationship and you look at your journey through a relationship, you start, you get to know each other, you might share each other's address, you sort of did it. And then all of a sudden there becomes this moment where you sort of go to, how do we share resources? and how are we opening up ourselves to be able to share them. And in that crucial moment, everything that we are taught and we have done before is challenged by that notion of, to make us become closer together, to us to move in this, the next step of a relationship requires us to share some information about our financial and other forms of resources, and how that becomes that crucial moment. So everything that is natural as to us as human beings starts to be preyed upon by those that are choosing to be abusive. And then I suppose that we heard earlier on from a couple of our speakers about how when you wrap that in cultural norms or religious norms, where the expectation is that one person is the, you know, the sole responsible person for a family household, how all that can form into sort of, you know, solidifying the fact that this person has more access than you would willingly want them to do. So I think you're right, Caroline. There was something there that your friend did, which was she tried to help in a way that you could hear. So exactly what Hannah was saying earlier is like the slow questions, the ones that aren't overt and sort of direct, are the ones that can sometimes be really, really helpful. So sort of on to, you know, asking you, Barbara, what are your thoughts around this?
Well, if I would have been asked before, I mean, conversations like you said, Hannah and Caroline, of friends asking you, are you okay with this? But because we're so much in isolations, you don't have friends, or maybe you hide it. So those are things that are kind of concerning, because you are in a bubble. If I were to look now, I pay attention more closely to these patterns, whether it's my friends, people around me, and indirectly I would share podcasts or share books or other resources that might help. And surprisingly, after I left that relationship, I've noticed that probably all women around me have experienced some kind of abuse or is experiencing some kind of abuse. And as much as I try to support them, uh, I'm always there as an open door, and being and understanding that at first people might not recognize that they're part of the abuse, so they're denying it. So offering that support and knowing that, hey, have you challenged this? Or what about this behavior? Or this and that. I think coming from my personal journey and the empathetic way that I approach things now, how difficult it is to be in this situation, I think it's important for us to share our knowledge, right? To help others, and maybe it will inspire like a grain of sand to them to be woke and understand the possibility, like, yeah, this is not right, or I should have not check in of my Starbucks coffee, or why am I checking in if it's okay to buy it? Go buy it. Go have your own budget. Go strategize on how to make more. Go buy that detergent, or go buy that toy for your kid if you need. Go buy that sweater if you need it for winter. And I think those conversations are easily can be open to your friends, you know, and strangers as well.
I thank you so much for that. I think you're right. There is something about how we as human beings as a whole, when we hear other people share experiences and their own sort of journey through pieces, it enables us to know more and to act and to, in many ways, to follow in their footsteps. And so being like sessions like this are so important, because not only do they raise sort of the issues of what's happening, but it also enables us to think, you know, there are journeys through all of this. There's a couple of things that sort of jump to my mind, really, is that, you know, throughout the summit, we've spoken about many different experiences, but we haven't necessarily spoken about what it's like to be someone who's entering retirement and that they've then experienced economic abuse through their adult life, so that their earning potential has been dampened and damaged by it. And what often happens, and, you know, different parts of the world will have different support mechanisms for those people in retirement, is it can be a shocking, scary moment. And in that moment, where do you access support? How do you reach out for help? And what help can be available is always quite difficult. I mean, I know in sort of our chats earlier, we spoke about, you know, how useful it is to speak to a financial advisor. Now, for most people, they may believe that a financial advisor is for somebody who has a lot of money to be able to be advised on. But actually, that's not completely true. A financial advisor is for everybody. In the UK, we have the Money Advice Line, and they will enable you to run through everything that's happening and then help you find ways in which you can, improve your credit, think about different ways that you can, sort out your bills so they're just yours. There are healthy practices they can offer. But you spoke about that to me previously about how useful speaking to my financial advisor was, Barbara.
Yes, I remember when flashback when I was asking for services, somebody appointed me to this CPA or CF yeah, I think he was a CPA, and I asked, look, I don't have any credit history, and I know at some point I need to lease an apartment. And this person was amazed, like, Barbara, look, 70% of the Americans are in debt. You're a clean slate right now. So if you want to build credit, you should start with a prepaid card. Whatever the money that you're earning from your internship or HRA, just combine it and deposit that money to slowly build the credit, and then just pay automatic groceries that you're already budgeting for. And that gave me more of like an empowerment for me to uh, build my journey into credit. Also, I love the fact that some banks in New York have partnerships with some nonprofits like Sanctuaries for Families or Safe Horizons, etc. They have the partnership that whoever's receiving services, they can open a bank account without the maintenance fee, right? Because sometimes you pay what, $5, $15, or a low maintenance fee. I think that is an opportunity for partnerships for banks to serve or help serve this community in very different ways. I think that's a step. Uh, Also, demystifying that you don't have a lot of, yes, you start with low budget, but how do you build it, right? How do you increasingly build it and take advantage of your knowledge of financial literacy? Just recently, my daughter, who's 12 years old, I think around 11, I got her a first bank credit card with my firm. And I remember when I had the conversation, I said, back in the 1950s or even less, like, women were not allowed to open a bank account. You're 11 years old, and this is your biweekly, well, she has to do chores, etc., to earn it, your biweekly stipend. And she was very happy about it. She was very empowered to withdraw money, tap with her whatever Starbucks that she wanted. And she understands, and slowly having those conversations of financial responsibility, right? You can't buy I don't know, you can't just go to Starbucks like 20 times a day. You're gonna deplete all that money, but how do you allocate it, and how do you purposely understand how to manage that? And then now it's a conversation that I didn't have when I was younger with my parents. One, because I was in another country, and now me knowing about how the economy works, or having a little bit of more awareness of economic standpoint of how do you read stocks, or all the companies that you buy, that she likes, whether it's Starbucks or things that she likes to buy or likes to see, or products. How does she understand at a not at an emotional level, right? That she might not like this company for X, Y reason because there's a better competitor, but how to take that emotional part and say, oh, this stock is racing a little bit, and compared to last week, and how does it work, right? So I'm teaching her these things to help her more confident as she grows older, to understand that it's a risk game, right? It's like a chess game, and how do you have financial stability, right? Just like me, when I have my 401k, if you have a company that matches completely, you should take advantage of that too. And when you're looking for a job, like what are the benefits? Like whether it's health insurance, whether it's the 401k or other benefits that the company might offer. I think that's whether they're paying for your education too. I think that's a lucrative way to see and to choose your path in your career after for any people, not just for DV survivors, right? But just to look into this perspective. I think I would appreciate before for somebody to tell me this at the beginning, but I had to ask, and there's opportunities out there that we deserve.
Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And you're gifting your daughter financial literacy and economic literacy that's going to carry her forward into her future, which is priceless advice. It's always so sad. We could talk for hours. I wish we could. But just before we come to the end, I'm going to ask you one question. What gives you hope right now for other survivors or the future on how we respond to economic abuse? Hannah, do you want to start us off?
Sure. For me, it's quite simple. Having these conversations, having this summit, having these continued conversations. I think, I have seen more and more. So the nonprofit that I work for, we have over 19,000 survivors that use our service, and seeing them discussing economic abuse while they're still in an abusive situation and seeing, hey, I need to find a financial plan to get out of this situation. How am I going to do that? And what does that look like? And that's what gives me hope, is that those conversations are happening and that this is happening and that more and more people are getting involved and knowledgeable about what this looks like.
So if you would like to join that conversation, how can you join that conversation with 19,000 other survivors? Hannah.
You mean in terms of how to get involved with SYTT?
Yes.
If you are experiencing abuse or have experienced abuse, if you go to Facebook groups and you search for Speak Your Truth Today, you can fill out our online survey for your own safety and for our members' safeties. And then you can join, and we are a peer-run support group. So that means that anybody who's currently experiencing or has experienced has the ability to help you and comment and support you in your journey and give you resources as you need. There are moderators that help and secure each post as we go through. But the best part of it is that it is survivors helping survivors. It is founded by a survivor. The board chair is a survivor. Most of the employees are survivors. Most of the volunteers are survivors. So it's a pretty cool organization to be part of. And if you need help, that's where we are.
Let's Speak Your Truth Today. Thank you so much for that. I always attribute Speak Your Truth Today to being the online version of a shelter kitchen. For anyone who's ever been or been to know the power of camaraderie and the sharing of information and the support that happens in the shelter kitchens across the world, refuges across the world, is just an amazing, amazing thing to witness. Caroline, what are your thoughts about what gives you hope right now?
I agree with Hannah. I think having these conversations is so important. We destigmatize economic abuse and we make it known that this is something that happens. It is a form of violence. It is a crime, and it should be treated as such. Economic abuse doesn't skip people because they have resources. It simply hides better.
That's really interesting. A really good point. And Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Well, I would have to agree with Hannah and Caroline that conversations like this gives me hope because our lived experiences are finally shared, right? And how programs are designed, right? From like I would vouch for a legislatively way for Caroline's of case or Hannah's case, like look it into a DV perspective and what programs or what law can we develop, right? What would be the requirements for this? I think that should be conversations on Bill or the White House or anybody in the state. And finally, like every time a survivor gets access to childcare or take a class or opens a bank account in their name, like it's a quiet form of freedom, and that's very important. And those small wins add up. And also, if you want to take part, like reach out to different nonprofit organizations or events that's happening. I'm hosting one. It's a first circle around. I created a beach volleyball ventures for volleyball athletes, and I'm partnering with the Family Justice Center to do a holiday drive in New York City, December 13th. So if you're interested, please contact me. And it's a very like for the holidays, uh parents, kids, like they need that spark of joy. So just reach out to the nonprofits, and it really, really, really does make a difference for families to know that there's an unknown person thinking of them, even if they don't know their story.
Thank you so much. That is such an absolutely amazing way to sort of end this brilliant conversation that I've loved every minute of. And thank you so much for sharing so much about your experiences and being so reflective on them. And, you know, what I have heard overall is that there is great opportunity to change systems and, most importantly, to some degree, the legislation. And that because legislation gives the framework in which we can ask for responses from. And I think that's, you know, but the most important element of it is that those that have had lived experience should sit at the center of those changes. When we start to think about how we could develop something different, you know, we need to have those voices in the beginning of that stage, not at the end where we sort of go feedback and, oh, no, it's too late, we can't change it. It's in that really early stages of conceptualization of what could work, what would it feel like? And, you know, I can see where it's worked really well. I can see, for example, in Comsbank in Australia, they've done just that. And then within TSB Bank in the UK, they've done that. They've really centered the lived experience, the voices of those that have the experience in how they approach it. And it feels different. I would, you know, from my perspective, I hope that we go forward with law and legislation in that way. We know that training and awareness raising in those, for those professions, it can make a difference, but it's a long journey till we get the understanding that we need. And actually that sessions like this make a big difference. And I know for those that have joined us today, I'm certain there'll be questions that have been answered by our brilliant team. But if there are additional ones, please reach out. And we have the global directory. There's a list of services there that you can reach out to. But if there's something specific that you're looking for, that, you know, there are services that are available too. Money Advice Helpline in the UK, for example. We have Free From in the US, and a number, you know, it's all listed throughout. But also, just to add, you know, we've had three, you know, you've all shared such different experiences and different journeys. And we know this has only touched upon the many experiences and different communities. We slightly touched on those that are in retirement. We've, you know, we also acknowledge that there are completely different experiences for the LGBTQ plus community and those living with disabilities. If you would like to learn more about that, there's a very interesting session in our In Focus sessions towards the end of the conference. But we are over in time, and I just want to say the biggest and most enormous thank you to all three of you for not only joining me on this discussion and being part of this panel, but sharing so much of your experience. The piece that, you know, the difficult thing is that you'll never see it, but I know that you'll be changing lives and people will be making different decisions because of what you shared today. And thank you so, so much. And on behalf of everybody else who's listening, a massive thank you too. And thank you for everyone who's listened and joined this. You know, if you think this will be useful and you want to reshare it, it'll be available on YouTube in the coming days. Please do. You know, if I could freeze some of the, you know, the comments that everyone's made and lift them up, I'm certain it will make a difference. So thank you again, and please stay for the rest of the summit. We will continue this work about raising voices and ensuring that we learn, because there is just still so much to learn and understand. So thank you.